You're out looking at houses and you see the perfect home that checks all your boxes. Should you, as a buyer, call the agent on the listing sign? Many buyers think that because the listing agent has a relationship with the seller, the agent will get them a good deal, and this may not be true. Remember, the agent on the listing sign works for the seller. Yes, their job is to find a buyer for the home, but their duty is always to the seller. I think it's fair to say that in the great majority of transactions, one agent represents the seller and a different agent represents the buyer. When one agent represents both buyer and seller, it's called dual agency, and it's allowed in most states, though it's illegal in 8 states. Here in Washington, it is legal as long as both parties agree to it in writing. But even if it's legal, it might not be right for you, and there is always an inherent conflict of interest. In fact, Washington stresses the limitations of this form of representation by calling it limited dual agency. Agents representing the buyer and seller often call this working both sides or double-ending a transaction. Here's an example of that conflict of interest I mentioned. If I'm representing just the buyer and I happen to learn that the sellers need to sell urgently because they're getting a divorce, and yes, I have had listing agents tell me this, I have a duty to tell my buyer about the seller's pending divorce. But if I also represent the seller, I cannot share this information with the buyer because it would harm the seller. In other words, the buyer is not getting the full picture. Another example, if I'm representing the buyer and seller, and the buyer's request for repairs is unreasonable, I cannot tell the seller this because doing so would harm the buyer, who is also my client. Here, the seller is not getting the full picture. So before you call the agent on the listing sign, understand that he or she already represents the seller and can probably represent you legally, but with some important limitations. Agents are compensated well, and you deserve 100% representation with no conflicts of interest. That's why I personally choose not to offer broker dual agency. I only represent the seller or the buyer, but never both, and I never lose sleep over this decision. So should you call the agent on the listing sign? In most cases, you're going to be better protected if you find your own buyer's agent, and make sure you read and understand the documents you sign. Good luck out there, and happy house hunting.